which is developing the vaccines and getting them licensed is like building base camp at the bottom of Everest. And actually getting to the peak is the delivery part. We have immunization programs in every single country around the world, but they are focused largely on infants and children as well as adolescents. There are countries that deliver vaccine to adults, and adults will be the first priority for this vaccine. We're not at the point of looking at immunizing children. And so there is going to be a struggle, frankly, in every country about how to do this quickly, how to identify the healthcare workers, how to identify the older adults, how to identify people who have underlying medical conditions, who will be probably the highest priority groups in each country. Added to that, not just figuring out who needs to get vaccinated, but we have to have healthcare workers who are trained to deliver vaccines. And yes, of course, there are thousands of healthcare workers who do this for infant immunization programs, but if we're going to be delivering billions of doses, even in 2021, we're going to need to surge on that. And then finally, we need the cold chain systems that actually move vaccines. All of these vaccines at this point either need to be refrigerated or frozen. And there are massive cold chain systems for the vaccines we already use. But some of the vaccines that are being developed now need special cold chain systems. And that's going to be quite a lift for pretty much every country around the world.
Thank you so much, Kate. There is a follow-up question coming from viewers as well. Is WHO doing something to support low and middle-income countries to be ready to deploy a vaccine?
I was going to add to what Kate said about this question, because obviously everybody's worried, vaccines are being developed around the world, but yes, a lot of them are being developed by the large companies, which means that they already have big manufacturing capacities. But our concern at WHO right from the beginning was, how can we ensure that vaccines are available, and drugs and diagnostics are available to people around the world, because this is a pandemic. It's not limited to a few countries. Almost every country in the world has this infection. People have suffered, people have died. And so it is but natural that we should think about equity. And so that's how the idea of the Access to COVID Technologies Accelerator came up. So when the DG, Dr. Tedros, launched this in April, along with several heads of state, a lot of the global health agencies, the United Nations Secretary General, everyone supported it, was about not only should we accelerate the development of these new tools, but ensure that once they're developed, that people have access to them. There's no point, if they're so expensive or unaffordable, that they're only reaching the rich people in a few countries. So from the beginning we've worked, and so we have something called the COVAX facility now, which is being set up by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, WHO, and CEPI. These are the three partners in the vaccines pillar of the accelerator. The idea really is to pool procurement there. On the one hand, you invest, CEPI is investing in vaccines, so to make sure they get developed faster and there are more of them. But on the other hand, we can also pool the procurement so that you get vaccines at a good price, you get it at large volumes, and then you have enough of that pool to distribute to people around the world. As Kate said, WHO has put guidance out. The SAGE put out guidance as to who should be the first in line. So we know that it'll be in short supply initially. But the way we're trying to take care of all countries, especially the lower and middle income countries, is by having this pool. Of course, it needs funding, it needs resources. And so this is where we're out now on a big fundraising for this pool. We need something like $7 billion to be able to deliver the 2 billion doses of vaccine by the end of 2021. That's our goal, which means about 1 billion people can be vaccinated around the world. That's the group that's at highest risk, that we need to protect urgently, whether they live in high income or middle or low income countries. So the COVAX facility has countries that are going to pay for their vaccines, the so-called, we call them self-financing countries, and there are countries that would depend on us being able to raise funds to at least cover the first tranche. So I think this would be an amazing thing if it happened. And it would be the first time, and I think in the history of mankind, that a new vaccine would reach individuals in all countries at the same time. We've seen instances where it's taken decades. The hepatitis B vaccine took like several decades before it reached people in the poorer countries, which is where the burden of disease was. We don't want to see that happening now with this pandemic. So it's really global solidarity, and most leaders around the world, heads of government, have committed to this. So we are very optimistic that this will happen, but there are several steps, of course, in the next few weeks. We need to work so that in 2021 we can actually start implementing this.
Maybe I can just add something to what Dr. Soumya said. You know, we throw around some of these numbers about how much it will cost the world to actually get these vaccines. You know, we need $7 billion or $5 billion. And I really want to put that in context. I think it's really hard for folks to wrap their head around what that number kind of looks like. In order to deliver on the promise of the COVAX facility so that, you know, countries around the world have access to vaccines for the highest priority populations in 2021, what we're talking about is less than $20 billion. Well, that sounds like a huge number, but let's remember that in travel and trade alone around the world economy is losing over $35 billion every 10 days. And so, you know, the entire cost of getting these vaccines and getting them in the volumes that we need and supporting countries to be able to actually deliver them is the smart economic thing to do. So especially as folks are thinking about whether their government is contributing to this is a smart thing to do from an economic perspective. We have a globally interconnected world economically, and unless every country is safe, then no country is really safe.
Thank you so much. Here is one follow-up question on cold chains. The vaccine is supposed to be kept at very low temperature. How will we deal with that?
So only some of the vaccines require a very low temperature, and what our friend on Facebook is talking about is what are referred to as ultra cold chain temperatures, where you have to keep a vaccine at minus 60 or minus 80 degrees. Some of the vaccines that Dr. Soumya has talked about do require that ultra cold chain, but not all of them do. Some of them require a usual freezing temperature or even being kept in a refrigerator. But specifically for the vaccines that require ultra cold chain, and the announcement we heard from Pfizer this week is one of these vaccines that requires ultra cold chain. There are new technologies for how to keep them cold. We can use dry ice. We can use special shippers that keep the dry ice in and keep them cold. So we're looking really carefully at a variety of technologies that can actually deploy these vaccines. We know from the Ebola vaccine experience, which also required ultra cold chain, that this is doable. And so we actually do have, in a limited number of countries, some experience of how to manage a vaccine in an ultra cold chain setting. But it's not a simple lift, and I think we do have to set people's expectations about the work that will be needed to get this to everybody that needs it.
Thank you so much. Our LinkedIn viewer is asking for a usual time frame to get a vaccine out.
It can vary, I think, because it takes from the time that development starts to the time it goes out. I think the shortest has been 4 years for mumps, is what I've read. The more usual timeline is about 10 years. It takes about 10 years because, you know, things go one at a time. You do your preclinical, then you go to phase 1, then phase 2, then phase 3, and then if the vaccine is successful, then companies start thinking about how to manufacture at scale. So in this case, the reason why we've been able to compress timelines is because people are thinking ahead and doing things in parallel, not one at a time. So even when the earliest stages of vaccine development started, companies are already thinking about how are we going to scale to billions of doses. Where are our partners around the world that we can go to for manufacturing? Of course, big investments have been made as well in manufacturing capacities. And also regulators are looking at this, you know, constantly from phase 1 to phase 2. So we reduce the timelines. So I think it's important because it's not that you're reducing the time to studying safety or efficacy. That's important and that cannot be compromised. But where you can save time is in the procedural aspects, in some of the bureaucratic aspects, and in the manufacturing, and in getting ready, as Kate was saying. We're already thinking, how are countries going to deliver this? Where are the refrigerators? Where are the cold chain? Do you have enough trucks and planes and things to transport this? Have the health workers been trained? Is there a policy that's been developed in every country? That's never happened before for other vaccines. Things take some time, and a few countries do it faster than others. But here, everybody is trying to be doing everything at the same time. So this, of course, is a huge stress on the system, but that's what we need now in the pandemic.
I think I can just add, it's also about collaboration. So, we work here at WHO, we work incredibly closely with UNICEF and with Gavi, with CEPI, with the World Bank, and many other partners, so that everybody has their oar in the water and is rowing as fast as they can, all in the same direction, so that we actually get everybody's effort driving at the same outcomes that we're trying to get to. And as Dr. Sumya said, for instance, in WHO, where we're responsible for giving countries, really clear guidance on exactly what they need to do to be ready, we started working on this in June. We didn't even have a clinical trial result of any vaccine at that point. So we've been working at risk, just like the manufacturers have been manufacturing vaccines at risk, knowing that we've got to, if we don't do this in a way where we're all working in parallel, we'll be losing time, and that means lives lost and suffering that could have been prevented if we had worked differently.
Thank you so much, Kate. Here is a follow-up question again from a LinkedIn viewer. How long have the trials run for this vaccine? Now you mentioned that this work started in June. What period of time have you used to follow up with volunteers until they develop immunity, and how long after they are still protected?
Ooh, that's a lot of questions. Maybe I can take one or two of those and hand over to you. Clearly the follow-up of participants is totally dependent on when the trial started. But I think what I really want to point out here is that we have set standards about how much follow-up does need to be seen in people in clinical trials before we think that there's enough safety data to even consider looking at the product for authorization. And different regulators are looking at exactly how much. So just as an example, the US FDA has said that at a minimum is half of the subjects in a clinical trial would need to be followed for at least 2 months of time. So those are just examples of the kinds of standards that have been set. We don't know actually about the duration of immunity because people are going to have to be followed over time. So we'll know whether a vaccine works for a year when a year has passed among people who have been vaccinated, and we'll know whether it works for 2 years when 2 years have passed after people have been vaccinated. There's no way to shorten that part. So as we watch to see these efficacy trial results come out, they are by definition, they are because of the nature of them about short-term protection.
I just want to add, absolutely, I agree with that. And so I think it's important also for trials to continue, because we shouldn't all think that, we've got 1 or 2, now we just stop everything. No, we need more vaccines, we need the follow-up, we need to know which ones, some vaccines may work better in some populations, like the older people generally, have less robust immune response. So there are certain kinds of vaccines which work better in elder people. There are certain kinds which are safer to use in pregnant women. So we need a variety of vaccines, and it's possible that some of the vaccines will have longer protection than others. And we will not know that unless we do the trials and we follow people and we collect the data. So I think it's also very good to see so many people volunteering to be in these clinical trials around the world. There are huge movements of people on social media saying they would like to be part of, and that's really altruistic of them to do that. And just one thing I'd like to say about what WHO does to provide guidance to manufacturers and developers of vaccines is we do something called target product profiles that we put out very early in the year. So that's something that people can look at to say, okay, what are your goals if you're trying to develop a vaccine? And we said we'd like to have at least 70% efficacy. We'd like the immunity to last for at least 2 years. We'd like it to be able to store at room temperature. We'd like it to be safe for everyone, including pregnant women. So those are the ideal characteristics that you would be looking for. And then there are the bare minimum characteristics that you would want, below which you don't want to go. So those are out on the website, and I'm sure have been useful for people who've been in this field developing vaccines. But kudos to all the scientists around the world who really have risen to the challenge and done this.
Thank you. You mentioned older people, pregnant women. Some viewers were asking, do we know if any of current candidates in a third phase of trials are also having one of those groups participating?
So for sure, many of the candidates are enrolling older people. And they've looked already at whether or not the vaccines stimulate an immune response, as Soumya described in the phase 2 trials, and are including older adults in the phase 3 clinical trials. The size of the clinical trials may not be large enough in order to answer the question, age group by age group, whether there are any differences in the effectiveness of the vaccine. But we can also learn about that even after vaccines are used in a routine setting, or are used outside of a clinical trial. So the studies that go on, I really agree with Soumya that we need to continue clinical trials, but even after a vaccine is authorized, the study of how the vaccines perform when we're using them, outside of a clinical trial is extremely important, because it helps us optimize how the vaccines are used, which age groups, which subpopulations, and we really would love to get to single-dose vaccines also. I mean, most of them are 2-dose vaccines at this point. So vaccine development doesn't stop at the point when we have one, good result.
Thank you so much. There is a next question. What type of vaccine is this one? Is it a live virus vaccine?
Is that about the Pfizer vaccine? When you say this one?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to take that?
But maybe we can explain what types of vaccines are currently there.
So, as I mentioned earlier, for the first time we have these new platforms, the mRNA vaccine, which is Pfizer, Moderna, and many others further down the pipeline. And what that is mRNA is part of the genetic signature, which actually, once it gets into the cell, it tells the cell what protein to make. So the mRNA vaccine is injected into the muscle. It goes into the cells. It starts telling the cells to make the spike protein of this virus, because most of the vaccines in development now are trying to target the spike protein. And then the body starts making antibodies against the spike protein. Also, we have something called the cellular immunity, T cells. So we have the antibody response, but we also have like the T cell response, which is very important to measure. And that's the response we want. So the approaches are different. So the RNA tells the body to make the protein and then the antibody. Whereas there are other vaccines, which are also in phase 3 trials, which are using the protein, just the spike protein. Again, there are various ways of doing that. Some of them are combining it with an adjuvant. An adjuvant is a substance which stimulates the immune system. So you combine adjuvant and the protein or the antigen, and then the immune system responds. There's also another way to do it, and that's by using other viral vectors, which are non-replicating. Like we've seen many vaccines being developed which use the adenovirus. It's a common virus that causes a upper respiratory infection, and there are some groups that have used a chimpanzee adenovirus. There are some that have used human adenovirus. So what you do is you take a form of the virus which won't replicate, but you put the genes of this COVID-19 virus, the SARS-CoV-2, into that, and then that is injected into the body, and then it starts again stimulating the immune response. So, and then there are inactivated whole viruses as well. So we have many different ones, more coming in the pathway. So that's why it's really exciting to see what's coming down, because we'll have the first few vaccines probably coming up with results in the next few months. But further in 2021, I think we'll see many more. And then hopefully we'll have a variety of vaccine candidates then to choose from that would make access easier, because you'd have more volumes, but then you could also target different groups, different populations, and so on.
The way I think about it is, I'm not sure this analogy really works, but if you wanted to have a cake at home, you have really two approaches. You can go out and buy a cake, so you can get the cake that's already made, or you can actually have a recipe that tells you how to make the cake. And so the the vaccines kind of fit into two categories. We're either giving a part of the virus itself that can't harm you, it's a subcomponent of the virus, but it's the part that we want the immune system to react to, or we inject the instructions for how the body itself can make that little part. And those are kind of the two big categories. And then within those, there are different ways that we make vaccines.
Thank you so much, both. Here's the next question coming from a Facebook viewer, Shaliza Dogra. Vaccines which are developing in particular area and being investigating in on particular population will be effective. Do we expect them to be effective for populations, all populations around the world, or will need to have different vaccines in different parts of the world?
First of all, this is a great question. I think the way to really address that is that we see no reason why vaccines that are developed are going to behave differently in one particular geography or another geography. But it's possible that that could happen. So I think what's really important is that we really need to finish the clinical trials and start using the vaccines, and then being really sure that we have good evaluations of how the vaccines work in different populations. We do have some examples of vaccines that work better in some populations than others, but those are largely vaccines against intestinal infections, diarrheal infections, and it really has to do with how common those diarrheal diseases are in one population or another population. Simi, I don't know, do you feel differently about that? Would you say that geography is going to be a pretty big determining factor? Do you feel comfortable that we should be going out with vaccines regardless of geography?
Yeah. I don't know of any vaccines that have had that sort of differential effect so far. So most vaccines that are used now work, populations around the world. So I would feel fairly confident. But I think it's the subpopulations we're more worried about is children, older people, pregnant women, So that's something we need to study, and that's why we need these large trials, because you need to look at these subpopulations as well, and then ultimately we can look across all of these different trials, maybe put it all together and start analyzing the data that way.
One follow-up question, thinking about different target groups and the plan for priority groups to be vaccinated. A question came, whether vaccine will be mandatory for children going to school to get a vaccine so that they can go back to school.
I think the first thing to say is that we're not at the point, when I say we, or the manufacturers, the scientific community, are really not at the point of looking at these vaccines in children yet. We really need to see what they do in adults, and then look carefully about how to move into children. And part of the reason for that is what we really would love for these vaccines to do. We've spoken a lot about what they do for disease, either preventing death or preventing severe disease or preventing even milder disease from COVID. But what we really want these vaccines to do beyond that, that's really important, but we really want them to protect against getting infected, just in your upper respiratory tract. And what would be great is even if you did get infected, if they protected against transmitting to somebody else. So those pieces of information about transmission are really important, and the reason I say that is that if they're going to be used in kids, what we're really also concerned about and want to know about is whether or not that transmission protection is something that could really benefit children.
Thank you so much. Here's the next question. Will prior COVID-19 antibody status be a determinant for prioritizing who receives the vaccine when this is made available to the general public, including healthcare workers?
So maybe I can answer that one, because we've looked at that carefully in the policy advisory committee that advises WHO. That's referred to as SAGE, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization, an independent group of experts from around the world who provide recommendations to the leadership of WHO on vaccine policy. And we've looked carefully at this in the SAGE group, and there is no, they are not recommending that we look at whether or not somebody has previously been infected or previously diseased, that the policy recommendations should consider people regardless of whether or not they have or don't have evidence of ever having been infected before.
you very much. Here's the next question. Now that there are evidence of COVID-19 mutation, such as the case we read about and learned about in Denmark, will the new development vaccine treat all potential types? So we'll have I just want to mention you the opportunity that tomorrow at the same time we'll have two experts talking about virus mutations and in particular situation in Denmark, but maybe we can address how virus mutations impact vaccine development.
I think it's important because obviously readers have heard about how viruses mutate or change, and we all know that influenza, in the case of influenza vaccine, every year there are experts who meet and discuss which strains should be included in the vaccine. It's because of the virus mutates and changes a little bit every year. So there's a lot of work going on in this, and scientists around the world are tracking it. So we at WHO have this virus evolution working group. Probably hear more tomorrow at your session about what's happening in this area. So this virus is also mutating, as all viruses do, and we're tracking the mutations to see what impact it will have, particularly on this spike protein that we've talked about. That's the target for vaccine development currently. And so far, there's no evidence that any of the mutations that have been seen would have any impact on the immune response that a vaccine would elicit. So far, so good. But this is something that would need to be tracked continuously. We don't know in the future if this virus also evolves, and we'll see when we come to that. But as of now, it seems to be not mutating at the speed at which influenza or flu mutates, for example. So that's good news.
Thank you so much. Here is the maybe before I ask next question, maybe we can summarize for viewers. We mentioned that we hope to have a ready, safe and effective vaccine early 2021. How long would be the rollout, since we won't have enough doses for everyone? So for how long we expect that we need to deploy a vaccine so that we become protected from this virus collectively?
There's no vaccine that's being developed right now that's going to have enough doses to serve the entire world. So the rollout of the vaccine is, the vaccines, is really going to depend on having more than one vaccine. And this is just another reason that Soumya has really emphasized about why we need to continue clinical trials and why the moment we get the first vaccine, that isn't the moment to stop. Really, the manufacturing capacity is extremely important. And pretty much for every vaccine, at some point or other in the course of manufacturing, there are some difficulties in the manufacturing. So having a really robust group of vaccines that can then ramp up in terms of production capacity. But what we're really aiming for is that in 2021, that every country around the world is able to immunize at least 20% of their population. That's the goal. And if we can do that, if we can really get that amount of vaccine around to every country, then the highest priority groups are going to be able to have some degree of protection, which doesn't mean that we just end everything else that we're doing. We already have lots of great interventions: hand washing, distancing, wearing masks when you can't distance, limiting the groups of people that you're around, being outside if you need to be around other people. So all of those things are not going to just magically disappear like that with a vaccine. We're really going to have to crush this virus by using everything that we have at hand, and certainly not taking our foot off the pedal at any point yet.
Thank you so much. There are still a lot of questions. I'll take a few more because we need to close in few minutes. Jan Mayers is asking on Facebook, how much percentage of global population would need to be vaccinated to end this pandemic, and that the virus is not a life threat?
That's also a very good question. Very smart viewers. Probably in the range of 70% or so. That's what we think. I'm going to give a slightly different
answer.
Okay.
This is great. I agree. It really depends what the vaccine can do. So if it only protects people against themselves getting disease and does nothing about transmission, that's a different situation than if the vaccine can really alter something about how much with what intensity it can transmit. So I think we're not really in a place where we can answer the question yet. But I agree with Sumya that, assuming that the vaccine has some of these characteristics, something around 60-70% of people.
The next question, will this new compressed timeline be used in the future to expedite more vaccine production?
I hope so. I hope so. We have other huge infectious disease problems around the world that we need to solve. TB is a good example. And if we can bring this kind of global collaboration around the development of new technologies and vaccines. I also think that this mRNA platform and the DNA platform, if it's proven in this pandemic that it has worked, then I think we'll be in a different position, because this platform allows you to very rapidly insert the genes of any new virus that comes along. So hopefully we'll be better prepared for the next pandemic. So I hope that this changes the way we do things in the future.
Last question. Since there will be mass distribution globally for the vaccine, counterfeit products will hit the markets claiming to be the right ones. What is the contingency plan for that?
So there are. This is an important issue, and the safety and security of vaccines is really important. There are methods that are used on medicinal products and vaccines, inclusive using barcode technologies, methods to identify this vaccine as a legitimate vaccine. I think the other point that's important is this is partly why ongoing, continuous, all the time monitoring of safety is important, because things can go wrong. There can be nefarious things like this that happen and that come into the supply chain. But these are extremely rare in the course of vaccines, and I think the concern is much more about assuring that we have adequate supply for everybody who needs it.
Thank you very much. And for closing, Dr. Sumya, we expect to have vaccine early next year. We see encouraging developments and news, but the cases are on a rise continuously. What can we do now? What are the proven tools so far that we can use? And also in the worst case scenario, if the vaccine is not working in the end, how we can stop this pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's really good to keep our expectations also realistic. So while we hope we'll get more good news about vaccines, it's going to take time to scale up production, to get them out to all the countries, and then to get enough people vaccinated so life goes back to pre-COVID days. Till then, we need to do the things that individuals can do now: physical distancing, washing your hands, making sure you're wearing a mask if you can't be physically distanced, or if you're in a place with lots of people. Avoid crowded places, particularly indoor, poorly ventilated places. Stay home if you're sick. Protect the elderly and the vulnerable within your families. Make sure they're not exposed. So there's a lot we can do now to protect ourselves and to protect others. And governments would need to keep doing what they need to do, which is having the diagnostics in place, making sure they're detecting people early, providing them care, making sure that they have supportive ways of quarantining all the contacts, isolating those who are sick. Those are the ways in which we can keep transmission under check and make sure that even if the virus is circulating, it's not a huge problem for society, for the health system. So we need to keep doing that for many, many months now, till we're at the point where everybody will, or enough people have a vaccine that, we can go back to being normal. But I think we know this now. It does require quite a lot of self-discipline to continue to do this. We need to motivate each other and to make sure that we can keep going.
Thank you so much. There has been a lot of work done as well among scientists and innovation on diagnostics and then therapeutics. So we spoke about that a few weeks ago as well, and we'll give the update soon. I have a long list of countries from where viewers are watching us from: Europe, Americas, Asia, Africa. So I thank you all very much for your questions. I thank you both for your time to answer the questions. Please join us tomorrow at the same time. We'll have experts talking about COVID-19 virus mutations, And next week, again, Wednesday at 5 p.m., we'll answer more questions on COVID-19. Thank you so much, and stay safe.